Okay.
Well, thank you so much for joining today, and really appreciate it. My name is Pianpian. I'm founder and CEO of Amotions. Amotions is a platform to help people develop important soft skills that are important for their life and career. And we are honored to have Steve here today to share his experiences and thoughts on mentorship. Steve is the strategic director of strategic initiatives at Yale Alumni Association. Steve and I have been friends since 2012 or 13. We co-founded an organization called Student and Alumni of Yale, and the mission was to connect students with alumni, and it has been growing since then. And Steve has still been helping out with that organization. So thank you.
No, thanks for having me. And I appreciate the time to share thoughts on mentorship. I know that two of the questions that Pianpian had mentioned were sort of a priori, were, how to find a mentor and what kind of advice should a mentor give. But I'd like to add some questions that I think it's important to create context for the whole thing. And so let me rhetorically pose a half dozen questions, and then we can address them all. And I think it'll still get where you want us to get. And obviously I'd welcome any thoughts, Emily and Kevin and anybody else in terms of all of this. These will seem logical to you, I think. One is, what can mentors even offer? In a way, it's asking what is mentorship, but I don't want to be quite that philosophical, but literally, what is it that a mentor could offer? Another question would be, why can't it just be anybody? Why couldn't you, tap somebody on the shoulder on the street and say, could you help me? A third thing is, when do you need mentorship? When in your life, what situations call for mentorship? A fourth question might be, how many mentors might you need? That may seem like a surprising question, but mentors, first of all, they don't come one at a time in real life. And secondly, it seems to me unlikely that one person could truly do all the things that mentors might be able to do. A fifth question would be, what are the types of sort of things that a mentor can help you solve? I mean, types of people almost. A sixth question would be, how do you find them? And that was one of the questions you posed. A seventh question would be, as a mentor, this is also a question you posed, how do you give feedback? What's the best way of doing it? And then finally, it doesn't have to be the last question, but it's the 8 that are on my mind. What might you avoid? What are things, in a dialogue that would probably not be productive? So those are some thoughts for us to discuss.
These are great questions. Thank you.
Sure.
And also, before we go into all those great questions, I'm curious, what makes you so passionate about mentorship?
Okay. So you're going to be sorry you asked me that question. I believe that nirvana exists in life and relationships and careers when you can somehow find yourself at the intersection of 3 things, what I'll call passion, aptitude, and need. What do you want to do? What do you do well? And what do people need? For most of my life, I was an investment banker. I worked for one of the large accounting firms, and then I worked for a family-controlled investment bank. And what I did was I helped people with companies make their companies more valuable or more liquid, or figure out what their companies were worth. And I think I did that pretty well. And it was exciting, but it wasn't necessarily the most meaningful thing I could do in the world. The reason that mentorship matters to me, that I'm enthusiastic about it, is that it's an opportunity to help somebody change a life. And by the way, it's not always the mentee whose life has changed. Sometimes it's the mentor. So it's just feeling like you're having an impact.
Did you have great mentors in your life?
I wasn't aware of it at the time because people like you didn't provide me the opportunity to even think about it. But I'm going to pose a question back to you and to Kevin and to Emily, which is what person or persons in your life would you automatically assume might be a mentor? Who are the most likely people to be sort of a mentor in your life?
Yeah, I would say your parents.
Right answer. I mean, every answer is the right answer, but absolutely. Now, I'm not saying everybody's lucky enough to have parents who can truly mentor them, but the natural position for a mentor might be a parent. And we all realize, of course, that some people feel their parents have an angle, and sometimes parents really do have an angle. And as we'll discuss maybe a little bit later on, that may not be ideal, but Kevin, I completely agree. Emily, any other thoughts on that, or Pianpian?
I think Emily might be noted. I can share first. So I think I'm fortunate to have multiple mentors in my life throughout different stages. I might not have called them mentor. They might not realize they're my mentor, but I ask different questions to different people at certain stages, or talk about scenarios, and people would give their thoughts and advice. So yeah, I think it's informal mentorship, might not be for an extensive period of time, but people are very kind in sharing. Yeah,
I think, as Kevin pointed out, parents would be in a theoretically a good position to provide mentorship. So might a spouse or a life partner, possibly even a child. I know it sounds strange, but remember, at my age, my children are in their 30s, and there are times when they can mentor me. Now, I do think there's a high correlation between good mentorship and wisdom. And wisdom is not to be confused with intelligence or smarts. Wisdom is sort of the combination, perhaps, of intelligence and experience. And you're more likely to have that when you're my age than my kids, who are half my age.
Right.
So, I should also preface this by saying, when I look at my own life, why do I care about mentorship in terms of where I've been? I told you that, I feel like I was doing interesting things, exciting things that I was good at, but they just didn't have sufficient meaning for me. But, I've had a chance to be a mentor for my kids. I have now lived for 9 years, since just after I met Pianpian. I've been living for 9 years in one of Yale's colleges as a resident fellow. And that means I've been living literally among the students, which, by the way, makes for noisy Friday nights. But it also means that I've had the pleasure, the privilege, really, of getting to know generation after generation of students and providing help. So, for me, whether I realized it or not, I was exposed to mentorship as a mentor now for quite a while.
Great. Yeah.
I do want to come back to one of those opening questions I posed. I don't want this to seem like it's a prescriptive or a menu, but I think it's important to sort of get out there some thoughtful context on mentorship. So what can mentors offer? What can, you, Kevin, or you, Emily, or you, Pianpian, offer as a mentor, or, as a mentee, what could a mentor offer you? And I'll just mention a few things. One is holding up a mirror so you can see yourself better. I'll call that personal insights. Another, which might be the opposite, is helping you network. Maybe you just don't feel like you have natural networks, and a mentor could help you either point you toward networks or lend hers or his to you. Another thing could be as mundane, if you will, as reviewing a resume or practicing interviews. What about, coming to a fork in the road, whether it's a career decision or a life decision? Could be a divorce, could be a marriage, could be whether to start a family or buy a house, could be changing jobs. That's an area where mentorship might matter. And finally, and again, this may seem mundane to you, but some mentors can simply help you with a process. Literally, what are the steps that I need to think about in order to do something? And so, these are all the kinds of things that mentors can offer. And you can already see how very unlikely it is that one person would be your mentor for two reasons. One is there's so many different things I just mentioned. And the other is your life changes as you go through the passage of time. Yeah. And so your needs change.
And what do you think is the difference between a mentor and a coach and an advisor?
So, good question. Well, let me pick advisor first. It's a good question. I'm going to ask you a question back, and I guess maybe poor Kevin, because I'll ask him a question too. But what do you think an advisor, intuitively, what do you think an advisor might lack that a mentor might have?
I think an advisor might not necessarily give you feedback, and they might try and just give you advice towards some. Oh, sorry,
That's okay. It's a.
I got a little kid there.
Yeah, I can actually build on that. Okay. So, yes, an advisor might have an angle, although you can find objective advisors. I'm not sure that objectivity is impossible to find an advisor. Here's my intuitive answer to the advisor part of your question, Pianpian, is advisors may not be empathic. They may not have empathy. They may be, clinically really, really smart, or knowledgeable on something, but there's this sort of magic sort of sprinkle dust that, perhaps you have if you can actually almost step into your mentee's shoes and feel how they feel. So there's that may be lacking in an advisor. A coach, I can do the same thing with a coach. I think a coach can be a great cheerleader. By the way, a mentor can be a cheerleader too. But in my mind, a coach is relentlessly upbeat, almost to a fault. They're trying to pull performance out of you. So in a way, they have an angle. It's a good angle, but they have an angle. I'm not sure that I believe that's a necessary condition for a mentor, to sort of, that they're just relentlessly optimistic or relentlessly trying to pull performance out of you. They are trying to convey wisdom, but that's different. So I know that's a long answer, but obviously, if you look at the intersections, there's a lot of intersection, but I do think they're different in that way.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear. Thank you for sharing the thoughts on that.
So, I mentioned earlier too, why can't a stranger on the street tap Pianpian on the shoulder and say, "Would you mentor me?" Why doesn't that work? Now, it may seem like an obvious answer, but let me tell you sort of 6 things that I think, I don't want to say tell you, I want to suggest 6 things that I think might be embedded in a good mentor, and the odds of finding that person on the street randomly are like winning the lottery in California. One, does California have lotteries, by the way? I assume you do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
So here are 6 things. These are off the top of my head. One is somebody who knows you, and maybe it's 7 things, knows you and is upbeat. Notice I don't make upbeat like relentlessly upbeat, but somebody who has generally a positive view of life and knows you. A third thing might be somebody who's objective. I view that as almost a necessary condition of mentorship is objectivity. Also somebody who's accessible. Can you have a mentor who's a good mentor without being accessible? Yeah, but you don't really have to want to work to have the dialogue go on. A fifth element of a good mentor would be somebody who listens well. That's of course related to being empathic, to having empathy. A 6th thing would be somebody who cares about you. That is empathy. It's one thing to know you. I might know Kevin, but that doesn't mean I care about Kevin. So you want both of those things. Your boss may know a lot about you. Well, I hope your boss cares about you. That's a bad example, but you know what I'm trying to say. And then finally, in addition to knowing you, being upbeat, being objective, being accessible, being a good listener, caring about you, this will seem obvious, is having the particular skills or perspective to help you with the thing you're trying to work out. What's that thing you're trying to work out? All of those other things are helpful, but they're not enough if the mentor doesn't have that particular skill. So I already mentioned this is the 3rd of those 8 questions, and I promise I'll stop every once in a while so Pianpian can ask me more good questions. But this thing about when do you need mentorship? I can tell you, I really think it's lifelong. At different stages, you need different kinds of things. Maybe very early on, your parents might be enough. B, and this is where it gets more interesting. I think you need mentors when you face risk or uncertainty, and or when you need to talk something through safely. Mm-hmm. By the way, I didn't read that somewhere. This is literally, I'm pulling this out of my ears right now. But, when you face risk or uncertainty, making decisions in the face of uncertainty is actually a sign of leadership. And again, there is such a thing as personal leadership. A mentor who can make you a better personal leader, leading your own life on purpose. That's a pretty good mentor. So dealing with risk or uncertainty, or wanting to talk something through in a safe space. Notice those aren't quite the same as each other. And then finally, I think I play a lot of tennis. I know that sounds like a non sequitur, but when you play tennis and you use a tennis racket, you get very attached to it, and you play on and on, but the strings are gradually getting old. Mm-hmm. And at some point, those strings are going to break. And it actually makes sense to take that racket to a pro or to a store and get the rackets restrung every once in a while. So the third, time when you need a mentorship, is maybe when you haven't had a mentorship in a while. Even if you don't know for sure that you need somebody, maybe I'm making up a time frame here, but every 6 months or a year or 2 years, you should have that kind of dialogue, even if you're not sure you need it. So I will stop there, because that's sort of 3 questions that, of the original 8 that I asked.
I think these are all great insights. Thank you so much for sharing that. I like the qualities that you kind of list out. I want to ask kind of more deep dive on each of them. For example, like you mentioned, a mentor should be someone that knows you. How do you? So does that mean that the relationship need to be built first before someone can be a mentor? And then do you ask someone to be a mentor?
So here's where it gets tricky, of course. You can't have everything, right? Yeah. And we all know that there are many people in the world, at times in my life, I think I was probably one of them, who feel like, I don't even know where would I find a mentor? How would I do it? I just don't naturally know who they are. So you may not always be able to find a mentor who knows you. I think it's going to be immensely easier for that person to be a good mentor if they do know you beforehand. Otherwise, you need to invest some time, at the beginning. Here's how you can find mentors. This comes back a little bit to the Pianpian question at the beginning, which is, how do I find one? I did take some notes on this. I think this was interesting. One is, look at your existing and past routines and social structures. What's the routine of your day, week, month, or year? What are the social structures you live in? Of course, there's family and friends. There may be an office environment, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, which is another social structure. There may be, and I'm not, this is not a judgmental comment, but there may be faith-related places where you have a social structure, like going to church, for example. If you look at these structures, work, faith, I didn't mention recreation. For me, I'm a racket sports nut. So I play tons of tennis and tons of platform tennis. By the way, a sport that doesn't exist in the same form in California as it does over here on the East Coast. But if you do that, people. And I'm still encountering people in the sports who I say, oh my gosh, I'm so lucky I'm going to make a late in life friendship just because I've been hitting balls with that person.
By the way, pickleball is big over here in California.
Yeah, pickleball we have in common. And I like pickleball. It's fun. As I get a little bit even older than I am, I think I'll be playing more and more of it. But it's a sport for all ages. It's great. So, these are places where you can find people. And finally, I would mention friends. And let's also make sure that we realize that it might not be current friends. So my very best friend, when I graduated from Yale and first went to my job at what was then Pete Marwick and then KPMG, when I first went there, my very best friend was a guy, I'll mention his name. His name is Ron Waters. And we were friends while he worked at KPMG. Eventually, he ended up working at Gillette and at Wrigley's and bunches of other interesting companies. And I hadn't spoken with Ron in almost a decade. And this morning I woke up at 4:30. I couldn't get my mind to stop working. And I sent him an email because I just realized I missed talking with him. And he's calm and he cares about me, and he knows me from admittedly decades ago. But there's a past friend who could easily become a mentor, or maybe the other way around. Maybe I end up as a mentor for him. So you need to look, there's this time machine you need to take sometimes to look at your friends, not only present, but also past. So that's a long-winded way of saying these, to summarize again: work, faith, recreation, friends, and anything has to do with a routine or a social structure might be a place to find friends. So you think that you're this sort of orphan in the world that can't find a mentor. You may not be right.
So you mentioned an interesting point about a mentor having empathy. Like, how do you know if someone has empathy, and how do you grow empathy if you want to be someone with empathy?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's very, empathy doesn't grow on trees. It's hard. Can you develop empathy over your life? Yes, you can. You actually really asked two questions, Pianpian, but sort of how do you know if somebody has empathy? If you're really listening carefully yourself, of course you want a good listener, but if you yourself are listening carefully, you'll realize that the questions that she's asking you seem customized to who you are, or seem customized to what they just heard, or seem to reflect the pain that she sees that you're feeling about something. So it's almost embedded in the question is an intonation or a connotation that otherwise wouldn't be there. An advisor might not be tailoring the question. A coach probably is going to tailor the question, but the coach is going to be tailoring the question to maximizing your peak performance. An advisor might not, a great advisor actually would be empathetic, but so the answer is, not that there's one answer, is sort of feeling that the questions are tailored to you, but not only the Pianpian of the moment, but also the Pianpian of the feeling somehow. Mm-hmm. So then the question becomes, how can you sort of ask, how can you become empathetic or work on empathy? I think it's important to be still. I think it's important to listen, really listen, not just hear the words, but be listening to the words and listening to the feelings of somebody. It's hard to train empathy, but it does take time and patience.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, I think that's one of the kind of important skills that we're hoping to help everyone to cultivate as well.
And by the way, I think that's an immensely important question. I know part of the reason you asked it is because you picked up on what I said earlier. Mm-hmm. I really think, empathy is not a necessary condition for everything, mm-hmm. but it tends to be an important trait for leadership. It tends to be an important trait for good communication. Mm-hmm. I think it helps move the world forward. So I'm glad you asked.
Yes, thank you. And we have some kind of users that asked before that are earlier in their career, and they would be thinking like, how do I get a mentor that maybe in a position that I aspire to be? For example, like if someone is a manager or individual contributor, like they're thinking, how can I get a mentor that might be in like a VP position that I want to be one day? Like, what do you think of that?
So it's interesting the way you asked the question. I almost would reword the question away from mentorship. You're sort of saying people would like to find a role model, that's a few more years along and has arrived at a certain position in the company. And of course, you'd like to find out how that person got to where she or he is. I don't necessarily view that person as being an ideal mentor. Maybe, what you're, in a way, if you're at a company. So when I joined KPMG, then Pete Marwick, I joined, and 2 years in, I moved from being a traditional auditor to what was called, what doesn't matter what it was called, but it was basically corporate finance. And it was a backwater, a little tiny thing back in 1976 in a large firm. And everybody who knew me said one of two things. They either said, you should, go talk to Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley if you want to do corporate finance. Don't do it as a backwater thing at an accounting firm. Or they said, don't do it at all. Stay in audit. 10 or 12 years from now, maybe you'll make partner, and that'll be great. But there were a couple of people at KPMG who sort of said, give it a try. And one of them, a fellow by the name of Jim Smith, who was a partner at the firm, did sort of take me under his wing. It's funny, I never really viewed him as a mentor. I certainly viewed him as a protector and sort of a godfather. And he really did help me become a partner over the next 8 or 9 years. But you could, of course, develop mentorship relationships at a company. So your question, the way I interpret your question is, how do I develop mentorship relationships in the office? I don't think it's that much different than what we said before, but I put up like a warning sign. I'm not sure that your mentor should be up the same chain that you want to go. I think your mentorship relationship should be avuncular, if you'll pardon the use of the word, sort of a sideways relationship within the company, so that there's a little bit more objectivity.
Yeah, I think some of the users, what they're wondering is not necessarily even someone in their company. It could be like someone outside in other organizations, but like maybe one day I want to be like that person. So
to me, that's perfectly laudable. I mean, I think that's great that, I wish I had thought that strategically, of sort of finding people and saying, that's the person I'd like to become, business wise or personality wise. But I think when you find those people, that's when you should go to your mentor and start a dialogue about, how do I become that person? Or how can I step into those shoes? I actually don't think that person becomes your mentor.
That's a very interesting point.
I know I'm pushing back at you a little bit on your question, but I have a slight allergic reaction to it. I just think that it's great. That shows great analysis. That shows great strategy. It shows actually a slightly lesser need for mentorship, but you still need a mentor to figure out how to get from here to there to be that person.
That's really good point. So it's kind of like thinking, like mentor could be like someone a peer closer to you instead of someone like that you aspire to. It might be a little bit more distant from you, right?
It could be a peer. It could be, but the reason I'm sounding cautious is it could also be somebody who's a rung or two up from you, but just not directly up. Maybe a rung or two up at another company, or a rung or two up in another department of your company, something like that. Because I want to go back to remember some of those characteristics that are so important in mentors. Objectivity, for example, a little bit of separation. Doesn't mean emotional separation, but it does mean, a different kind of separation.
Yep. Thank you, Steve, for sharing these. I think you have a few other great questions. So
let's
go over
those. Back, I don't want to miss anything important here. How many mentors might you need during the course of your lifetime? I don't really know the answer to that, but the next thing I'm going to say is going to sound like a cliche because people have said it before, but think of mentors as almost kind of like your board of directors, your personal board of directors. And, do companies have one director? No, they don't have one director. They almost always have somewhere between 3 and 10. I mean, some boards are even bigger, but that's ridiculous, when it comes to personal mentorship. There's some number of mentors that you need. In a perfect world, at any one point in time, it might be between 2 and 7 different people that you need. And by the way, the board, just like boards change, so do the mentors that you need change. To which you might say, okay, well, let's be a little clearer about why do you need more than one? We talked earlier about what they can do for you. But, in my mind's eye, I can think of at least 4 categories of mentors, if you will. Networkers, I know I mentioned that word already. Strategists, where do you want to be in 10 years? And what are the skills you're going to need to get there in 10 years? And what resources will you need? And things like that. These are sort of strategists. The third is logistician. Not quite the same as a networker. Networker is just somebody who's fearless, doesn't worry about rejection, kind of can just do outreach and outreach and outreach to sort of multiply the number of relationships you have. Because I think we would all agree that relationships are really a very important aspect of a meaningful life. So networkers, strategists, logisticians, meaning literally they really nail the process. Very few strategists are also good logisticians. Very few strategists happen to be good networkers. Occasionally they are. And then a fourth thing, in my mind's eye would be personal development wise people. I know I'm not saying that very well. I don't quite mean shrinks or psychoanalysts, but it's somewhere a little bit more real worldish. People who, recognize who you are as a person and recognize or listen to you when you say where you think your shortcomings are, and can help work with you to change those not change your personality exactly, but address those weaknesses and leverage the strengths. And so I think that sort of HR personal thing is different than being a strategist or a logistician or a networker. I'm sure I've left out things, but those are four interesting categories. So you wanted me to address some of the other questions. That was one of them. And then, in a way, we're sort of winding up toward the home stretch here. There are two more questions. I won't address them until I give you, Pianpian, a chance to sort of see if there's things in between we should talk about. One is, how should you give feedback as a mentor? And another would be, what might you want to avoid? So let me stop for a minute and see, are there things that you want to backfill in there?
Before you go into those two questions?
Yeah.
And actually, it's very interesting. You mentioned a few terms like networkers, strategists,
logisticians, and and personal advice, personal wise people.
Right. So does that mean that you're thinking these mentors are good, for example, like good in setting up strategies or good at like networking, or is that what it means?
Yes, it means that their aptitude, remember passion, aptitude, and need kind of, their aptitudes are in one of those areas. And I'm not saying you can't find somebody who has more than one of them, but I am saying that it's highly unusual to find somebody who's truly really good at more than one of them. For example, because if you really want to be clever, you could poke at me right now and say, "Okay, Steve, what do you think you're best at? As a mentor?" And I'll punish myself by answering my own question. What of those things? I am not a good networker. Although as you get older, by the way, the world shrinks. It's a weird thing that happens. More people and the world feels smaller. So I guess I'm doing better as a networker than I used to. I'm definitely not a logistician. I've never been a detailed person. I think it's either sort of strategy, thinking 10 years, where do you want to be, kind of asking the right questions to draw that out, or it may be recognizing or listening for somebody's personal strengths that you can build on, or areas for improvement that you can address. So it's one of those.
Yeah, that's great. And I think like when you identify some of these people, how do you have the conversation? I guess people don't directly say like, do you want to be a mentor, right? Like, how do you start the mentor-mentee relationship?
Yeah, how do you break the ice?
Yeah,
it's interesting. It's a really interesting question. A lot of times it's helpful if there's a go-between to make an introduction. It feels awkward. It's hard. I'm not saying you can't do it directly. I think most of the time people do it directly, but isn't it nice when there's an introduction of some kind? Kevin, you're in San Diego, right?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's something that's going to sound like a non sequitur, but what's something you're interested in that has nothing to do with work? It's not a trick question. I'm just curious.
I'd say like as recreation, like soccer. I enjoy talking about politics and psychology and sociology.
Yeah. So it's interesting, I have a Yale buddy, and there's a couple, actually, it's an amazing couple who both graduated from Yale in 2011. And their names are John and Tara Falcone. and they live in San Diego. John is a rising star in the Navy, and Tara is a lifelong, very committed to financial literacy. And then they're wonderful people, more importantly. John is a total jock. So, my instinct is like, if you ever met John, you would enjoy talking with him. He's a real out there personality. It happens to be lacrosse in his case, but he can do anything. So, why am I mentioning all of that? It's because sometimes the way that you can get close to somebody who could become a mentor is sort of, I just don't think it's a great idea to walk up to somebody, even if you're sure they're a perfect mentor, and say, would you start a mentorship dialogue? It's like, whoa, time out. That was, you were in my space, It might be trying to find common ground. That was a very long way of getting to the answer, which is either an introduction or a real introduction through a go-between, or finding common ground.
Kind of what I've experienced is you will just meet somebody for coffee or dinner or whatever.
That's right.
And then you'll just talk about whatever interests you, and then your interests somewhat align, and then they find out, and then you find out maybe that person knows more than you or has a lot of wisdom, and
or maybe you end up helping them.
It could be right.
In Dutch, I don't know how to speak Dutch, by the way, a tiny bit of German, but no Dutch. There's a phrase that has to do with sort of being aligned or collaborating or seeing things. We would say eye to eye. They actually do nose to nose. There's some phrase that has to do with noses pointing in the same direction. I need to go find it now, of course. But, this is what you're talking about, and what we're talking about right now is just finding some easy, low maintenance kind of commonality, and letting some chemistry develop around that commonality. And maybe that person gets to know you better that way too.
Now, do you, if you have something in mind, do you directly bring that and then say I'm thinking about this and would like to hear your thoughts on this?
Yes, but not on probably day one, and possibly not on day 3. I'm about to tease you, Pianpian, so this is a micro alert, since this is being recorded. One of your endearing qualities has always been, in the almost decade that I've known you, is that you actually are very direct. And, if there's something on your mind, you just sort of say it or ask it. And I am saying that when it comes to developing that kind of relationship, sometimes there needs to be 2 or 3 intermediate questions. It's a great skill to have when you're doing what we're doing right now, recording a session that needs to fit into an hour. Yep. It is important when you're mentoring, though, to sort of somehow, it's not exactly sneak into it, but ease into it.
That's very interesting points. Yeah. Thank you. I would be curious to hear a real life example, if you have one in mind, example of how a mentorship conversation starts, or the beginning of that.
Yeah, I think it almost always starts with something, as Kevin implied, other than mentorship.
Right.
It's have you tried this pizza in New Haven? Have you tried this pizza place? Since we actually are the pizza capital of the world. Hey, Bar Pizza just opened up 4 years ago. Have you ever been there before? Let's go there. And talk and just see where it leads. And I understand that sometimes time is of the essence, and that may be frustrating because I'm making this seem so natural, and yet what if you really want advice in the next 3 days, and you don't have a month to develop that relationship? I don't have an easy answer for that question. I wish I did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that.
So I did want to address the sort of 7th of the 8 questions, not that these are biblical 8 questions or whatever, but it is one of the 2 that you asked, which is sort of, how do you give feedback as a mentor? And I'm going to be literal. I mean, not what you say as a mentor, but how you say it.
Right.
Because what you say is going to depend on what your mentee needs, right? Do they need, resume practice or interview practice? Do they need to have somebody hold a mirror up to them? It's how you give feedback. And in my mind, I think there are at least 3 elements. One is, don't give that feedback unless not only have you listened, but your mentee knows you've listened. It's not quite the same thing. Just listening and making sure that your mentee knows you've listened. Why? Because your advice will have more credibility and impact on your mentee if you've listened, and especially if they know you listened. They're going to believe you more than if you just pop right in with that advice. This is for the Steve Blum of 10, 20, or 40 years ago, this was a bigger problem than it is now. It used to, because you can tell I'm a high energy person, and that can get in the way sometimes. Boom, I want to jump right in to show how enthusiastic I am. But sometimes I have to shut up and listen for a minute, like that. So the second element of giving feedback is it's two things combined. It's being direct and being gentle. And you can do both. I mean, it's, they're not contradictory. But it's very important. By the way, the word but is probably the enemy of these kinds of things. I try so hard to avoid using the word but. And is a way better word. Being direct, if you're not, think about the alternative. There's this risk if you're not direct that either the dialogue gets complicated because perhaps your mentee isn't good at hearing indirect. I happen not to be good at hearing indirect. One of the reasons Pianpian and I can be friends for the last decade is she is direct. Sort of says something, I get it. Kind of going circuitously doesn't work as well with me. It's just important to do that. So one is the sort of complexity of not being direct, and the other is you could lose your credibility. Somebody could interpret indirectness as not exactly dishonesty, but just not being completely there. And then the gently, I guess, goes without saying. Once you get to know your mentee pretty well, there are mentees who can take tough love. But, I would say the safer way of going at it is doing it in an encouraging way. And then the third element, so one is listening, the other is sort of directness and gentleness combined. The third thing, this is something that we all forget. And I did write down a note on this. So I'm just going to read you my note. At times and on days when you and your mentee can both be mentally fully present. What if you didn't get a good night's sleep? What if, on Tuesdays, it's Kevin's day with the kids? There are things, I'm teasing you now, but you get the idea. Is it really helps if the feedback can be given at a time when both people can kind of be mentally present. And that can have to do with getting enough rest. It can be location, it can be day of the week, it can be month of the year, it can be seasonality. So thinking about that sounds like logistics, but it's pretty darn important logistics. It's sort of, you're not always going to be able to do that, but it would be nice if the setting was good. So that was that was one of your two questions, and it was the seventh in my long list of contexts. The final one is sort of what to avoid. I probably shouldn't do that at the end because that sounds like a negative thing, but I wrote down a few things. One is try not to make this too much ad hoc. What I mean by that, spontaneous isn't necessarily bad, but I think that a good dialogue should have some cadence to it, C-A-D-E-N-C-E. Mm-hmm. It should have a rhythm to it. Doesn't mean that every 2 weeks on Tuesday at noon California time, 3 p.m. New York time or New Haven time, we should talk. But somewhere in between, there should be some rhythm, I think, to make a dialogue work better. So not having any rhythm makes it harder. The second thing is, this relates to what I had said before, I think times when the mentor or the mentee are both tired or distracted, that's a hard time to have the dialogue. Mm-hmm. So that's something to avoid. And then the other thing is maybe information overload. So, perhaps the mentor has accumulated quite a bit of information. Maybe it's not a good idea to download all of that on the mentee at the same time. Conversely, earlier in the dialogue, it's up to the mentor, I think, to sort of say to the mentee, time out. You just gave me 18 pieces of information. Whoa, can we just do three for now? So the information overload can come from either direction. So again, sort of some rhythm, the ability to be present and not distracted or tired, and thirdly, kind of too much information, dosing the information out. And again, I'm sure I'm forgetting things, but these are things that are probably negatives for good dialogue. So I will stop now and have at me if you want with other questions, but those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, these are really thoughtful answers. And thank you so much for thinking through all the questions and thoughts in advance. One quick follow-up on the feedback part. So how do you start the feedback conversation? Do you tell someone, I have some thoughts on what you just wrote or what you just said? Like, how do you have a real example of like, how do you phrase something in a caring and encouraging way, but still useful for the person?
Yeah, and again, I apologize if this sounds cliche, but we all need reminders of things. I think the way to do it is to couch it as an opportunity. Hey, I see something here that could really, move you forward toward the decision you have to make, or it's like that. It's framing it as an opportunity. We all know that famous phrase that the Greek word for crisis is apparently synonymous with opportunity, crisis, opportunity. It's like that. It's even if something seems like a big challenge, it's sort of, hey, I think we can break this logjam. I have some ideas for that, and so then it becomes a positive discussion.
That's great. So the word feedback is not necessarily mentioned.
Yeah.
It's very diplomatic.
Feedback might be ideas, if that's what the mentor is being asked for. It might be perspectives. You see there's a subtle difference between ideas and perspective. An idea might be something out of left field that the mentor, maybe that is something a mentor should do. We didn't say that before. That could be a fifth category of mentor, is an idea generator, is an innovator in your life. It's okay. So I think I probably lost my own train of thought right there, but it's just perspective versus idea. The idea is something perhaps entirely new. Perspective might be taking what you've heard from your mentee and letting her see it in a different way.
That's really good. Thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people wonder about like the feedback question is not just in mentor-mentee relationship, but in other areas of life as well.
So I see somebody, I'm not sure if it was Emily, I just didn't look, but somebody asked a question about icebreaker questions. And maybe to some extent, we talked about this, but what is a good icebreaker question when you sort of encounter somebody, for example, at a conference and it strikes you that you'd like to get to know them better. So these may seem very obvious, but one would be, what brought you here? I like not yes, no questions in general early on in a dialogue, versus yes, no. So, who, what, when, where, how, as opposed to the yes, no. And so, what drew you here? What was it that, intrigued you about this conference? Or, I see that you came here with several other people. How do you know them? It's something about the environment of that person or what got the person there, just to start a discussion. I don't know. I know it sounds like I'm struggling a little bit with it, but it's so contextual, sort of depends how you encounter that person. I don't think it's normally going to be, the clothing they're wearing, or the color of their hair or something. It's going to be something a little bit more profound than that. If there's been a particular news item that isn't religious or political, there could be some news item that would be relevant to everybody who's at that conference. And of course, you might say, gosh, did you hear the news? What about that? Just as a way of having something to talk about.
That's a really good idea. Yeah, thank you. I think one thing that I have heard people asking is like, how do you make a mentor-mentee relationship kind of, you mentioned that yourself, like helpful for both sides, for both the mentor and the mentees. And I think oftentimes mentee would wonder, like, what do I offer back to the mentors?
So great question. Should have asked that question earlier. But what can the mentee offer back? And actually, I'm going to bifurcate that question into two things. One is how can the mentee sort of feel like it's not a chore for the mentor? How can the mentee feel like it's okay? And the other is, what can the mentee offer back? They're related. I think a great mentor feels that she or he or they never stop learning. that the opportunity to, and Emily, you're welcome. I see the thank you in the chat box. A great mentor is always learning just from having the dialogue, perhaps feeling engaged. Why do Yale alumni, for example, mentor Yale students? Partly it's a time machine back to Yale. Maybe the mentor isn't inclined to give money to Yale at this moment. Maybe the mentor isn't inclined to do something that requires hours and hours and hours, but they do feel like they're doing something, giving back to the institution by helping its students. So, the mentee, just by having the dialogue, is actually giving something to the mentor. So I know that doesn't fully answer your question, but what can the mentee do that's more concrete? So one thing I'm saying is the mentees should psychologically realize that a really good mentor probably is getting a lot out of the dialogue, period. Just is inspired by having the chance to talk to maybe a younger person or somebody to help solve a problem. Maybe they feel pretty good, they're helping to solve a problem. As far as what can you give back? Well, as you get to know your mentor, you're probably going to find out that the mentor has, I don't want to say deficiencies, but areas where they know less. And so maybe you know more. The classic, of course, generationally is, the younger generation knows more about tech, so maybe the mentee can provide the mentor some tech knowledge that the mentor didn't already have.
That's very interesting. Yeah. When I see, I think, Kevin, you have a question?
Yeah. Do you think there's a lot of places where the kind of mentorship or kind of relationships could really benefit and don't really exist in the United States currently, or in particular? Do you think it's in a lot of places?
Yeah, I do. I want you to make a guess.
Sorry, one more thing, and then how would you cultivate that kind of?
Yeah, great.
Because I think it is, and I have experienced situations where it is kind of built into that relationship, and there was just a lot of benefit to that.
I was tempted to ask you back how you would answer it, but to save time, I won't. I'll answer it. It's a good question, Kevin. Great question. Not one that I expected. I think in the political arena, my instinct is that if we had different ways of creating mentorship in our political structures, we might have different outcomes than the very difficult outcomes we've had lately. And it would be nice if those mentorships could exist across political boundaries. They used to, there used to be people who truly got wisdom from people who weren't from the same party. Can I give you this is going to sound like a digression, but I'm not sure it is. There was a study done a few years ago of the political correlations of marriages back in 1970 versus the political correlation of marriages in 2010 and 2015, sort of 45 years later. And back in 1970, the correlation of marital parties was almost random. Hard as that is to believe, you could almost roll the dice and the husband and wife, could be whatever parties. We all know that's not true now. The correlation is incredibly high, Democrat, Republican to Republican. So, and mentorship unquestionably exists in some ways within marriages. So, I guess I'm extending your question. That's a really, really dicey one, to sort of how can we create those kinds of relationships that cross party boundaries and that have a mentorship aspect. So I think it's greatly needed in our political world, and it may in fact be needed even in our marital world.
Yeah, great. That's interesting to think about.
Well, I think we've gone the hour, Pianpian. So
yes.
I want to be cognizant of whoever ends up listening to this, that we don't want them to have to invest too much time. But I've certainly enjoyed talking with both of you and with Emily, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Steve, for sharing all your thoughts and experience and wisdom.